But finally, at long last, an American journalist goes and has a conversation with Donald Trump about what the plans are. And we find out he's going to deploy the military, but he's for that. He's locking up political opponents and prisoners, and the list goes on. But
Are you going to get locked up, Steve?
it's incredible to be asked the question, right? It's incredible to be asked the question. I'll tell you this, well, it's incredible to be asked the question. It's incredible to be, to consider the question, but you can't be intimidated by it, right? At all. I'm very pleased this afternoon to be joined by my friend Matt Littman, a wise soul and person when it comes to American politics and a lot of stuff. Matt, welcome.
Thanks, Steve. Good to see you as always.
I am, by word and deed, I think, pretty committed to keeping Donald Trump out of power, out of office, but I am worried about his return. And so people ask me all the time, do I think Biden will win? Been out of the country, a lot of people ask me, and what I say to them is always the same thing. I say my heart tells me that President Biden will win. My head tells me something else. So I look at the world right now, and I look at the war in Gaza, and I think Israel's losing the war. I think that Biden's losing the election. If it were tomorrow, Trump would be the president, but it's 187 days away, so a lot of time on the clock. And I look at the trials. I evaluate these trials in their aggregate now as a disaster. If Trump does win, history will be very, very brutally unkind to these trials and to the discretion of the prosecutors and a lot of their conduct, I suspect. But how do you see that?
I tell people in our entertainment group, Steve, and outside of it, the same thing, which is where everybody has anxiety about this election, right? The stakes are enormous in this election. The best thing that you could do is do something. Don't sit at home and watch the news all day. Don't focus on your Twitter feed. Do something. If you do something, you'll feel like you have some sense of control. So I know you're in the arena all the time, right? You've worked on many of these things and you know. So what I say to people is, what matters here? What matters here is not California. What matters is not New York. What matters are Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and then from there, Arizona, Nevada, you know what the swing states are. Do something. Get people out to vote. Give money. Knock on doors. Michigan has early in-person voting, Steve, for the first time this year, where it starts, I think, like October 26th. Go drive people to the polls because every vote is going to matter in those states. Do that thing. Do something. But if you sit here and just watch TV, you may never get up from your couch. You may be so scared. I am more optimistic now than I was, let's say, 6 months ago. I feel that the Biden campaign is super well organized. They're getting people out into the states. We seem to do better as Democrats in every election lately. It doesn't mean we will in 24, but the polling seems to show us not doing as well, and then we do better. Tom Suozzi in Long Island, for example, was a recent example of that. And so I feel good about the Democratic Party's ground game and what we're able to do in these swing states. But I would say to people, if you have anxiety, go do something. Really, do anything. Make phone calls. That will be helpful to you and your own mental health.
When we sit around and BS and talk about this stuff, I think about, I have this collection in a box, somewhere in storage now, right? Of all these old Time magazines and Life magazines, we go back to the 1930s, and I have some of them at the house, and I love looking at them, like opening up a time capsule. And you look at this era where there's so much crisis in journalism, such a collapse of trust between the American people and the media. And, Time Magazine, which, I think has become rather celebrified and fatuous, all of a sudden, like kaboom, right? Time Magazine is back, right? A cover for the ages for whatever reason, right? There was no prohibitions that prevented anybody else from writing it. But finally, at long last, an American journalist goes and has a conversation with Donald Trump about what the plans are. And we find out it's going to deploy the military. We're going to have mass deportation camps that in most countries would be called concentration camps, filled with millions of people that will be shipped out of the country. We'll have 100,000 soldiers plus in America's cities and tanks and armored personnel carriers. The government will be able to monitor women's pregnancies. I was on Scripps News last night, and the question they asked was, well, what do you think they mean by monitor women's pregnancies? And I said, well, good question. But I suppose what that means is this, that, and tell me if you disagree with this, if you interpret this the same way, or I'm full of shit. Right? But what I think it means is that all pregnant women are potential suspects for the crime of abortion, which has to be evaluated if there's a loss of that pregnancy at any point during it, that there's always the possibility in the woman's heart of a malign intent towards her unborn child. Thus, we have to monitor all the way through. And I really don't understand intellectually, once you get there, why you're not then monitoring the birth control, right? And other things as well. But he's for that. He's locking up political opponents and prisoners, and the list goes on. But
Are you going to get locked up, Steve?
it's incredible to be asked the question, right? It's incredible to be asked the question. I'll tell you this, well, it's incredible to be asked the question. It's incredible to be, to consider the question, but you can't be intimidated by it, right? At all. But what I think's amazing is when you get the question, which is basically a version of, well, what do you think he means by that? I think my answer is, I suppose he means he wants to open up concentration camps. And what can you explain that?
You
Do
also,
have,
by the way,
9 years into this, any kind of take on the, what I would say is what do you think he means by that?
Well, I would say, when you talk about groups, that he's being very clear at this point. In other words, if Donald Trump becomes president in 2016, famously the night of the election, they never thought they were going to win until the results came, right? They weren't planning a presidency. Everyone was planning to send out their resumes, and they already were, for their next jobs. They've been planning this one for years, so they're ready to go. And when we talk about who might get locked up, and we talk about a woman who's had a miscarriage, for example, but also the doctor, right? We talk about journalists. Journalists would get locked up in this circumstance, and they will make this happen. I have no doubt about it. They believe that they are going to have the Justice Department on their side. They're going to be changing a lot of the laws in this country. We've even talked about, not today, but the Comstock Act, which would allow for birth control to be sold through the mail. You will not be able to get birth control. Like, they are very clear. The Heritage Foundation is a right-wing organization that's made very clear how they want the government to work in a Trump presidency. And the other thing is that people need to remember that if Donald Trump is out of his term ends, somebody said to me the other day, we were talking about 2028 presidential candidates, Steve. That's how far down the road we were. And we're talking about all these great people like Gretchen Whitmer and Wes Moore. And they said to me, well, what's the difference about 2028? There's not going to be a democracy in 2028. So what would be the difference? In other words, if Donald Trump becomes president next year, do you think he's leaving office? Because he'll have committed 400 more crimes and would be prosecuted again the minute he left office. You think that he's leaving office in 2029? Of course he's not, right? So, do we want a king in this country? And I think people need to really think about that. One more, Steve. I'm just going to say one more quick thing. When George Washington led those troops across the Delaware, right? They were going to fight those German soldiers across the Delaware. They weren't talking about climate change. They weren't talking about the minimum wage. It was beating that king and that government and having self-government and having a democracy in the United States. We don't have to go across the Delaware in the middle of the night in the freezing cold with snipers on the other side. We have to get on Zoom, go knock on doors, go give some money. And that's how we're going to save democracy in just the same way.
And if we were going to have a king, why the fuck would we pick Donald Trump? Which seems like a perfect place to leave it.
All right, Steve. Good
Matt
to talk to
Littman.
you, buddy.
Good talking to you.
Talk to you soon.
I'm Steve Schmidt. This is The Warning, and I invite you to join, subscribe on our Substack, on our YouTube channel. Follow us. Welcome to the community.